Hey everybody, the channel's been going a few weeks now, and thank you so much to those of you who have viewed or commented on my first few videos. Two of those videos were about subjective and objective truth, and one was about a Ken Ham video, which hopefully was interesting, if not a little frustrating. Returning to the topic of subjective and objective truth, I thought maybe today we could have a look at a debate. I'm interested in one of the biggest questions or problems that we raised in previous videos, which was when two sides of a debate are either addressing the question completely differently, or they are misinterpreting or misrepresenting the question entirely, which just results in a debate which isn't much of a debate at all because both sides appear to be answering a different question. Now, I found a random debate online, and what I found was that there was a lot to talk about just in the opening statements. So I've re-recorded this introduction after watching the debate, because initially I was going to watch the whole debate and react to that, but it's 2.5 hours long, and there was a lot to say just from the 2 times 6 minute opening statements. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at the opening statements and see what we can find in there that relates back to the subjectivity versus objectivity topic that we've looked at previously. So I think it might be quite interesting. We'll have a look at it and we'll see what we can see. So this is the debate that we're going to watch. As I said, I haven't seen it before. I didn't choose it for any particular reason other than it popped up in my YouTube feed and I thought it seemed like a good candidate. There is no title screen or anything, so it just jumped straight to it, which is why it's paused on the screen it's on. And it's a debate between Matt Dillahunty and Cliffe Knechtle. And the question in the title of the debate is Christianity true? Now, I don't know about you, but I'm already thinking that this is quite an interesting question for a couple of reasons when it comes to subjective and objective considerations. There are probably a couple of different ways to interpret this question. I suspect that the intention of the question is Christianity objectively true? Now, it would be handy if they included the word objectively there in the title or in the question, because as we've already looked at, all knowledge is subjective. There's no such thing as objective knowledge. You can arrive at subjective knowledge of something being objectively true, like the laws of physics, as we looked at in the last video. And if you haven't seen that one, then you might find it interesting. It might even be worthwhile watching it before you watch this one, because there may be some references to it. I don't know, we'll see how it goes. But the point is, the question is already slightly ambiguous, because it simply asks, is Christianity true? Now, you could include an appendix to that question in brackets that says, is Christianity true for me? Or is Christianity true for everybody? And of course, those two questions carry entirely different connotations. Is Christianity true for me is a purely subjective question. Is Christianity true for everybody would be a more objective question. Because of course, if Christianity was true for everybody, then that would include everybody, whether they are Christian, atheist, Hindu, or anything else, or even if it's a person who has no concept of religion, full stop. That's what we mean by objective. But with the counter still at no minutes and no seconds, I'm already kind of frustrated that the question isn't a little bit clearer, because it doesn't tell us, just like the 6 and 9 image from the first video that I made a couple of weeks ago, the question or the title doesn't seem to tell us what's the goal of the debate. Maybe I'm wrong here, and as soon as we get into the debate, it'll become clearer as to the specific version of this question that the participants are trying to answer. So I guess we'll just get stuck in, otherwise you're going to spend the whole video just listening to me waffling. So let's press play. I'm not going to keep interrupting the video, don't worry. We're going to let people speak and then pause it at hopefully a good time where we can reflect on what they've just said before I forget it. So let's go, let's see what they say.
Hey everybody, tonight we're debating whether or not Christianity is true, and we are starting right now with Cliff's opening statement.
Thank you, James. Thank you, Matt. The question is Christianity true? I am convinced that in order for a religion or a philosophy to be worthy of our belief, it must account for the meaningful realities of life. And I find that Jesus Christ accounts for the meaningful realities of life like nobody else. First of all, I'm confronted by a world, as you are, where we have a war in Ukraine and people are being murdered and killed. And then we have a child sex traffic trade. And then we have very good people doing a lot of very good things. And we have countries sacrificing for other countries. There's this amazing combination of the good and the wretched. And when I look at the different philosophies of life and the different religions, Jesus Christ stands out in his piercing analysis of the human dilemma, which is a dilemma of the human heart, meaning by that the human soul, meaning by that the human mind, will, emotions that tends to rebel against God and at other times tends to do that which is very good. So we are a weird concoction. And I find that to be true of reality, and that is exactly what Jesus Christ talked about. Another basic reality that he talked about. James, I think I've lost you totally now.
We can hear you. We're...
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
Pretty good. Well, I'll just keep going. The question is, why are human beings valuable? And every human atheist friend of mine is convinced that human beings are valuable. But why is the question? And Jesus Christ points out that we all are valuable because we're all created in the image and likeness of God for a purpose. We're all loved by God, and God considers us so valuable that he wants to give us eternal life. And that's exactly what Jesus Christ said is the way to eternal life. It's through faith and trust in him. Another reality that I experience every day is an innate drive to do that which is good. Is good real, or is it just a myth? Now, I'm convinced, due to the exercise of my conscience and due to the exercise of my atheist conscience, my atheist friend's conscience is, that good is real and evil is real. And the only way that can be real is if there is some type of mind prior to the human mind that creates and defines the values of good and evil. So Jesus Christ answers that basic human reality in a powerful way. And then I go to funerals. I perform funerals as a pastor. And the question is there life after death? Matt, I'm very grateful that you had successful bypass surgery. That's a tremendous affirmation of life, that the doctors were able to use their skill to heal your heart. And I'm so excited for you. I've been praying for you. But I can promise you, we all have a desire to live life. And Jesus Christ promises eternal life to all who trust in him. Now, why is he true? Because the evidence points to him. What is evidence?
So the timer is on 3 minutes. So 3 minutes into Cliff's opening statement. And if you notice that the first thing he did when he started talking was address the question, as in, recap the question. What he did then was say basically that the thing is true, as in Christianity, because the book that says Christianity is true says it's true. Any sort of confirmation that what he was saying was accurate came from the thing he's trying to prove. It's this circular logic, which it is. There's no debate over that being circular logic. You're not using anything from outside of it that suggests that it may be true. Now, that's a little bit different to something in the physical world. For example, an apple. Proof that the apple in my hand exists could reasonably be the fact that the apple is in my hand. But verification of that comes from the fact that you can touch it, you can pick it up, you can feel it. So there's a tangible physical element there, intrinsic to the thing we're trying to prove, that proves it exists. I mean, it doesn't get much better than that. I think only using A, the Bible, and B, Cliffe's understanding and recital of the Bible, for me it just always seems to be the same argument. And the only reason that I think it would be satisfying is if it confirms what you already think, which is really unfortunate, because it doesn't lead to a healthy debate then, because what you end up with is the people who can really get behind Cliffe's side of the argument are already behind that side of the argument. And this brings it back to the purpose of the whole debate. What are we debating here? What are we contesting? What's the outcome? So are people on the fence going to listen to somebody saying that Christianity must be true because this book about Christianity says it must be true? Are they going to accept that, do you think, as convincing evidence that Christianity is true, which is the purpose of the debate? Now, obviously, we haven't heard the other side, the no side, speak yet. I'm assuming that much of the evidence from that side will come from the physical world, and that will include things that Christians, atheists, Buddhists, or anybody else could go out and measure for themselves or observe for themselves. Now, the only way that you can truly observe the things that Cliffe has already held up as proof of his side of the argument and Christianity being true is that you have to sort of already share his belief and accept that those things in the Bible are true. Everything he says or has said so far relies on accepting the Bible as truth. Well, if you do that, then you're already there. I hope that makes sense. The other thing that Cliffe does, as do most people that I have seen who are on Cliffe's side of this debate, is they use words such as the only way that X is if God exists, when that's just clearly and obviously not correct. It's an assertion that he makes that you can understand, in terms of you can understand why he makes it if you hold his beliefs, if you share his beliefs, but it's used as an objective claim to prove this side of the debate, and it just doesn't work. And this is already getting into what I was talking about before, in that he is saying these things as if he is making objective assertions, and yet it's just completely incorrect that those things are objective assertions. And it's almost shameless, really, the way in which these assertions are made, as if they are objective, when they just clearly aren't. They're just not. Anyway, let's get to the end of Cliffe's opening.
Facts that point to a conclusion. And the evidence is that Jesus Christ lived an amazing life, taught incredible teachings, died on a cross forgiving his enemies, and 3 days later, he rose from the dead. Now, is that scientific evidence? No. Scientific evidence does not tell me anything about George Washington being first president of the United States. Scientific evidence tells us nothing about whether Matt's wife really loves him or whether my wife really loves me.
No, true. Who knows? Maybe one day science would be able to tell us if somebody does truly love somebody. It's a ridiculous comparison. In the context of this debate, a fair comparison would be, can science tell us whether Matt's wife exists? And the answer is yes. When the topic of the debate is something true, To say that science has nothing to offer the debate because science can't answer questions currently, such as, does somebody love somebody? It doesn't make any sense, right?
Different types of evidence. There's scientific evidence, but there's also historical evidence, and there's also relational evidence.
What kind of historical evidence is outside the realms of science? Presumably we're talking about historical anecdotes or historical writings. Well, the writing itself, although it's from history, could still be viewed through a scientific lens.
And you and I, as thinking human beings, must be open to philosophy and logic and reason. You and I, as human beings, have rational minds. And part of reason includes science. It also includes logic, mathematics, but it also includes the relational. And I can promise you my relationship with my wife and my sons and my grandchildren, my daughters-in-law, is far more important than any scientific postulate. Jesus Christ addresses this powerfully when he points out, the purpose of life is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. It has the ring of truth. It has the ring of reality. So, truth is that which is real. Evidence are facts that point to what is real. Can I prove anything in life? No, I can't prove anything in life. To prove means to show that it cannot be another way. So no, I can't prove anything beyond.
No, I don't think it does. I don't think that's what proof means. Do we know that water is made from hydrogen and oxygen? Yes, we do. Can we prove it? Yes. Could there be some as yet undiscovered truth about water? Yes, of course there could. He, as apologists often do, is sort of playing with language. He is using his own interpretation of certain words very authoritatively to make it sound like that's what they actually mean. And unfortunately with language, whilst language is generally fairly objective, as with all knowledge, as we've already said, including the knowledge of language, it's still subjective. So although two people can agree what a word means, one of them could still use it with only 99.9% of their meaning being the same as somebody else's, but that still makes it ever so slightly different. So you have to allow for some difference in how we perceive the meaning of words. And I don't mean that you just have to let everybody make up their own meanings, but we only have a limited vocabulary in English, for example. There are only so many words to choose from, and most of us, I think, only use something like 20,000 words or something out of a much larger possible vocabulary. And this is well known, it's well documented, and it's really interesting. For example, I believe in Greek there are around 12 different words for love, different types of love, different meanings, different contexts and expressions of love, whereas we just have love. And then to specify what type of love we're talking about, we would need to add other language on top of it to clarify the type of love we mean. So language plays a large role here.
Beyond the shadow of a doubt. But as a thinking human being, I'm not a cynic. I don't use the fact that I can't prove anything to say, well, therefore I can't know anything. No, I can know things scientifically. I can know things mathematically. I can know things logically and rationally. I can know things scientifically. Shortly after World War II, General Dwight David Eisenhower asked for journalists from around the world to come to Nazi Germany. Why? To record Dachau, Auschwitz, Buchenwald. Why? Because Eisenhower wanted to make it very clear. Dachau, Auschwitz, and Buchenwald, the horrible prison camps of the Nazi Germans, was not propaganda. It was the truth. There's a difference between propaganda and truth. And the fascinating thing about faith in Christ is, if he rose from the dead, he's the truth. If he didn't rise from the dead, he's a liar. In other words, Christ.
I'm sorry to stop the video there, by the way, Cliff. I didn't do that deliberately. One or two sentences can come at you so quickly that you barely have time to process the logic of one before you're on to the next. And just the logic of that last sentence. If Jesus rose from the dead, he's the truth. If he didn't, then he's a liar. Yeah, granted, if he did rise from the dead and that is factually true, then yes, it appears to be a true claim that he rose from the dead. And if he can do that, then there's no reason to doubt pretty much any other claim that is made about Jesus. But the opposite, if he didn't, then he's a liar. Well, those aren't the only two options, though, are they? Accusing him of being a liar about rising from the dead is to say that we accept that there's a guy called Jesus and that he claimed that he rose from the dead, but he didn't really. So therefore he's a liar. It implies that the only two outcomes of this sort of very brief logical junction that Cliffe proposes here is that either Jesus rose from the dead, in which case he was telling the truth, or Jesus didn't rise from the dead, in which case he's a liar. No, those aren't the only two possible outcomes. Both of them rely on some sort of evidence to corroborate that story. And how on earth are you going to prove, as Cliffe just used the word, how on earth are you going to prove that Jesus did rise from the dead? What's the point in this postulation anyway? Cliffe has basically just said that it's impossible to prove either way. The only thing that we really have to go on is the book written by that side of the debate that say that the thing they say is true.
This gives us a way to verify him or falsify him. That's tremendously appealing to me as a thinking human being who is interested in truth. Now, if I say that I believe something is true, but I find that I can't live it out, then I better go back to my initial assumptions about what I believe and question them and ask, what is a more accurate view of reality? Jesus Christ presents a profoundly accurate view of reality. Read the Gospels, examine them for yourself, and you'll see that the evidence is he's not a quack, he's not a liar, he's not a lunatic, he's not a legend, he's the truth. So that is why I'm convinced that faith in Christ is very wise. Provable? No. Evidence pointing to it? Absolutely yes.
How can something be not provable, yet all the evidence points to it? Am I misunderstanding something here? If all the evidence points to something, can it not be provable? I think this comes down to Cliffe's use of the word provable, or I don't understand what it means to prove something. A court of law may be a decent comparison here because all of these words apply to that situation. So when we're trying to prove that somebody committed a crime, what we're looking for is evidence to prove that. And considering that I believe the law says that somebody is innocent until proven guilty, if enough evidence comes along to prove them guilty, they're guilty. Now, if you apply this to Cliffe's use of those words, he's saying that in a court of law, somebody comes into it innocent until proven guilty, and all the evidence points to them being guilty, but they could still not be provably guilty. I don't understand the logic, considering this is the underpinning of Cliffe's opening statement, which is about, is Christianity true? And he specifically mentioned evidence himself. Nobody asked him to cite evidence. Nobody asked him to do anything other than open his argument as to why he believes Christianity is true. Now, I would say that the majority of that he spent citing the Bible, not word for word. I know he didn't quote it, but he was basically making the argument that the Bible and the account of Jesus and the things that Jesus said is the only real thing that he has to explain reality. It is basically what I think he was saying there. In a world of, as he said, I think wicked or wretched was the word that he used, and good. It's only the things that God and Jesus say about it that can make any sense of it, which still doesn't really answer the question of is Christianity true. But at least Cliffe does return to that question and say, well, in order to decide if I think something's true, I rely on evidence. And as far as I'm concerned, there's a ton of evidence that suggests Christianity is true. However, I can't prove it. I think that's fair to say. I don't think Cliffe would object to me summarizing his argument like that. I mean, that's literally what he said in the last sentence. I don't find that very satisfying, and I feel like I should, if I should be able to listen to an argument from this side of the debate and at least find their logic satisfying, even if I don't agree with their position. I'd love for something to come out of this side of the debate that is logical, feels somewhat objective at least in its nature, but it just doesn't happen. And I'm afraid that this is another example here from Cliffe, because everything he says relies on you accepting that what the Bible says is true, and the only thing he really grants you is that if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then he's a liar, and it's fair enough to doubt it or to reject it. That doesn't really help the person on the fence, because in order to side with Cliffe in this debate, you already have to be 95% of the way there and accept that the Bible, which is pretty much the only thing that he's using as his evidence, is true, as we've already said. So I don't find that a particularly satisfying opening. Although I'm sure if I was a devout Christian, I would think that it was right on. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily a bad thing, but I'm sure that the people that were already leaning to that side of the debate will have found that satisfying. Okay, let's move on. I am going to have to make this much quicker, I think, because this debate is 2 hours and 37, and at the rate that I am prattling on, this could be a 6-hour video, which I don't think anybody wants to watch. So let's move on to Matt's opening.
So with that, we're going to kick it over to Matt. I want to say thank you, Matt, as well. The floor is all yours for your opening statement as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. And thanks, Cliffe, for the prayers as well. I'm sure there were plenty of people praying for my heart, and all of them will give credit to God for saving me from dying a year and a half ago. But I'll credit the doctors and science, because that's what actually did it. So,
ouch, that was a bit stinging right off the bat there, wasn't it, from Matt? But I meant to say something about this actually in Cliffe's opening, and he said that he had been praying for Matt to get better, which he did with the help of doctors and science. And this is actually a really interesting point, and it for me it goes slightly beyond the simple argument of what caused Matt to get better. I'm not saying that these guys are simplifying the argument, but I'm just saying as a thought experiment, the argument is more complex than that. So on the one hand, you've got the question of what saved Matt in this case. Was it God, with or without Cliffe's prayers? And on the other side, was it science and the doctors? So it's really interesting as a thought experiment, actually, just to dive a little bit deeper into both sides of that question, or both potential answers to that question. So considering the explanation that God helped Matt to get better, well, we know that physically the doctors intervened and science instructed those doctors. Nevertheless, let's assume that God did it. Now, there are just so many questions that create an absolute rabbit hole here. So the first question is, if God put all those things in motion that saved Matt, were they kick-started by Cliffe praying? Or would God have done them anyway? That in itself raises some questions. If Cliffe's praying encouraged God to help Matt, then what does that tell us about the omniscient and omnipotent power of God? Does that mean that we can change God's mind? If so, does that mean that only people like Cliffe can change God's mind? Do you have to be a Christian to do that? Presumably, yes, I guess. It just raises so many logical questions that don't appear to have an answer, let alone a satisfying answer. So, like I say, if God did it, did God do it because Cliffe prayed? If he did, then that means that God's open to having his mind changed. And what does it also say about God's plan? Was God's plan for Matt to die from whatever it is that was wrong with him a year and a half ago, and he changed his mind because Cliffe prayed? Was his plan for Matt to get poorly, Cliffe to pray for him, God to instruct the doctors to fix Matt, and for Matt to get better? What a convoluted plan that sounds like. I can't believe that that's the case. Because the implications of these sorts of situations are ridiculous, because it must have also been God's plan for Cliffe and Matt to cross paths at some point so that Cliffe would know who Matt was in order to pray for him, right? It just doesn't... There are so many ways you can cut it that just don't make sense. And then considering the alternative, that God had nothing to do with it, and what saved Matt was the actions of the doctors, which were informed and instructed by science, which is the result of human development over hundreds and thousands of years. Are there any logical contradictions that arise from that being the cause of Matt's return to health? I can't think of one. I can't think of one. The only really difficult question in that particular line of questioning would be going all the way back to what kicked it all off in the first place. What I mean by that is, if it was the doctors that helped Matt, then they were acting guided by science. And then you could go back before that and say, well, what led to that science? Well, it was this science and these discoveries and these people. Okay, and then you'd keep going back to a point, regressing through history to say, well, what was the cause of that? Well, it was that human discovering that. It was that prehistoric Homo sapien discovering fire or whatever. You get the point. There's no place where it logically falls down in the trail, and then you're just back at the classic old-fashioned creation versus science sort of debate. And I'm not saying that when you get to that point you have to invoke God. What I'm saying is that because we don't fully understand what came before, for want of a better word, the Big Bang, even though there might not have been anything before it in the way that we understand it, and that's a topic we're not going to get into today. But when you come back to this question, which is still very difficult, I'm not saying that we should invoke God. I'm saying that that's the first point where we don't really have a satisfactory answer. And I include everything from that point up to Matt getting better, including evolution, the creation of the planets and the sun. We have a very good answer for everything that led to that point of Matt getting better. If it was doctors and science that did it, if it was God, there are just so many questions that don't have any logical answer. It just doesn't make any sense.
The subject of tonight's debate is supposed to be, is Christianity true? And for me, when we look at whether or not something's true, we need to, or any debate topic, we should probably define terms. And I think I heard Cliff say truth is that which comports with reality in some version or another. So I think we're on the same page with regard to whether or not something should count as true. It's just seems to be, how are we going to define the key elements of Christianity, and how are we going to verify that those things are actually true?
I'm really sorry to pause again so soon here, but I'm so glad that Matt said that, because that's exactly what we said at the beginning. I think the first thing we said was, well, there's no definition of terms here. What question are we answering? What question are we answering here? So I'm really glad that Matt has gone back to address the question of the question. And I think it shows that we were right in pointing that out at the beginning.
And if the criteria that we use to verify Christianity, when applied to other things, bears those out as well, and they are in conflict, then our methodology is horribly flawed. Because if the foundation that we use to say, the guiding or the principal foundations of Christianity are true, if those are claimed to be true on the same criteria that would also prove Islam or Scientology, then we don't have any methodology at all, because we've now confirmed competing ideas using the same methods. So if for example, to go to fantasy for a moment, Narnia, I think we would all agree, is not a real place. And yet the concept of Narnia exists in minds, and it exists in writing. And in addition to the books about Narnia, there's a map of Narnia. And one key principle in logic when we're discussing fallacies is not to confuse the map for the place. It is very tempting to look at and say, oh, we seem to know so much about this, or there's so much information here that this must be real. That's not the exact pathway to the fallacy, but it's what I think of when I start talking about the concept versus the thing. Now, within Christianity, how would we go about understanding what the foundational ideas are? I would tend to go to what the Bible says and what has been traditionally identified within Orthodox Christianity, going to Paul and Romans and talking about, if Christ be not raised, our faith is in vain. The resurrection of Jesus Christ must be the cornerstone of Christianity. And other factors like there is a God, that Jesus is either God incarnate or a representative of God, however you might end up looking at it. But those elements are the bedrock. How would we demonstrate those? Well, we only know that they exist because of a book. And we can't use the book on its own. The book on its own is insufficient to verify the claims, just as the Quran on its own would be insufficient to verify the claims of Islam, and Dianetics on its own is insufficient to verify the claims of Scientology. So that method is insufficient. So we need something beyond that. Now, if we don't have empirical evidence for a physical claim, the least, or the broadest position we can have is, we don't know whether or not that claim is true. So if someone tells me, hey, this individual rose from the dead, and we have nothing but the claim and a bunch of people who believed it, and no physical evidence of that to verify it, I can't believe the claim. If you were to say, is this statement true, and insert a statement, you could get a yes answer for statements that tie to things that are not demonstrable. For example, there may be a diamond the size of my fist, 10 feet below the soil at a particular location on Mars. That may be true, but if someone were to come in and say it is true in a debate, they would need to be able to demonstrate it. Anything that you can't demonstrate is merely identical from a logical perspective to something that isn't true. From our perspective, it's not true until it's demonstrated or demonstrable. And so if that item were to exist on Mars, it may be in fact true that the item exists, but it would be wrong for us to say it is true, because to make a claim that something is true carries with it this notion that you can demonstrate it in some way. Now, what way do we have to demonstrate anything supernatural? As far as I can tell, we don't. There are plenty of claims that something is supernatural, and when you drill down, what you're getting is I've experienced something, or it has been reported to me that something occurred for which I am not aware of a natural explanation. Therefore, the explanation, or the most plausible explanation, is one that is supernatural. That is a fallacious line of reasoning that is predicated on the notion that you would need to know everything in order to know that there was no natural explanation just because you don't have one now. And so I don't know of any other way I don't know of any way anybody has ever demonstrated that the supernatural is real, exists, is true, can in fact interact with anything. And yet those are the foundations behind Christianity and other claims, because God exists supposedly outside of space-time. God's ontology is supernatural, beyond nature. How do we demonstrate that? We still don't have any way to demonstrate that any such thing exists, let alone a specific thing exists. And yet somehow there are people who seem to know, or think they know, a great deal about the specifics of the supernatural and God. For example, and I promise I'm not just doing this for fun, and I'm not trying to saddle Cliff with somebody else's views on God. But this week, because it amused me and it confused me, I'm going to share a tweet from someone who may in fact be watching. The tweet reads, "My Christian beliefs point to the 5 generals running hell: Baal, impurity; Lilith, female lesbianism; Asmodeus, sodomy; Baphomet, child sacrifice worship, abortion, killing innocent offspring; and Leviathan, female homosexuality." Now, this individual, despite the fact that this is not expressly covered in the Bible in any way, believes that they understand that hell is real, that hell has an organizational structure, that organizational structure has 5 generals, which are somehow responsible for various sins. And this individual seems to think that female lesbianism and perhaps female homosexuality are 2 different sins. And I don't know what female lesbianism is versus male lesbianism, but the 5 ones that they go through tell us much more about this individual's psyche and what they think than anything about a real hell. And yet there are countless people sitting in churches, once again, not saddling Cliff with this. What we need to do is figure out, how is it that this person thinks they know the specifics of hell and hell's structure and sin, and what makes them right or wrong compared to Cliff's model? Does Cliff think that these are the 5 generals of hell and what they are? And if not, how does this become a part of Christianity for a person? Because while Cliff and I disagree on Christianity, I also disagree with the individual who made that tweet about the makeup of hell. And I would have disagreed with that person even when I was still a Bible-believing Christian. And I would think that many of my debate opponents would also disagree with this person. I remember a time when I stood in front of 4 Christian apologists just before a debate, having a discussion about what the Bible has to say about slavery. Not only could they not agree on what it says, they couldn't agree on what it meant. And so my position was, you guys get together and tell me what the actual position is, and then we'll dig into it after that. And I never heard back from them. So what specific, empirically verifiable, non-mundane facts can we verify with regard to Jesus? Now, I'm not a mythicist. I'm not going to say Jesus never existed. But the fact is, there isn't scientific evidence to confirm his existence or any of the elements of his life, right up to the most important aspect, which is crucifixion, and I think, or his resurrection, which is, I think, something that Cliff just noted, that you can't provide scientific evidence. You can't provide scientific evidence on this. And Cliff would like to use examples like love. We can't scientifically prove love. Well, we can, in fact, investigate the human brain and the feelings of love scientifically. But where we are barred from investigating things like love is in the mind itself. I don't have access to your mind and your thoughts, but a resurrection is not a mind encapsulated thing. A resurrection is an occurrence in space-time of someone being dead and then raised from the dead. To pretend that this somehow puts it in the same fuzzy, unable to touch criteria as love is a misrepresentation of the facts. What we need is a way to demonstrate the truth of the foundational claims of Christianity, and I have yet to hear one.
The question of did Jesus rise from the dead is not the same type of question as does somebody love somebody? As Matt says, one is a question about whether or not something objectively happened. The other is a question about the subjective, at least for the time being, because we don't currently know how to objectively verify if somebody loves somebody. We might be able to do brain scans one day that identify some sort of neurological signal that can prove that somebody is in love, but until we have that, then no, unfortunately, we can't. Ultimately, though, I think Matt is basically saying here what we were trying to say at the beginning, which is that the question that forms the topic of this whole debate is essentially an objective question. And however difficult we may concede it is to prove that Christianity is true, what Cliffe is doing, or has done so far, is essentially offering a very subjective basis for the claim that it is true. The whole thing rests upon a subjective appraisal of a book that was written to promote the thing that Cliffe's trying to prove is true. So it's not a very fair source of evidence, really, because that's its whole job. I think the point that Matt makes quite well there is the way that people claim to have some sort of authority of knowledge about these very subjective or anecdotal things, and they extend that to give themselves knowledge of the whole universe that somehow has become equal, if you like, to other explanations and other worldviews that are based more heavily on the objective. You'd have to say that Cliffe hasn't really included anything objective in his opening statement about this question, which is intrinsically objective, whereas Matt has not attempted to offer objective evidence to address the question and say that Christianity is not true. What Matt's tried to do is point out that this is an essentially objective question that needs to be treated as such, and that no amount of referencing the Bible will give you anywhere near the level of objectivity that you can really use to try and back up a question that is based in the objective. The burden of proof, if you're arguing that something is true, is on the person saying it's true. If I tell you that I'm holding a rabbit behind my back, it really is not on you to demonstrate why I'm not, because until proven true or untrue, that claim is just an unknown, but it certainly can't be assumed to be true. If I want to push the argument or persuade an audience that I am indeed holding a rabbit behind my back, The only real way to do that would be to show you the rabbit. I could skirt around it and come up with all sorts of other reasons why you should believe that I'm holding a rabbit behind my back. For example, I could have somebody standing next to me that says, yep, he's definitely holding a rabbit behind his back. Convince a few people as that may, that's not going to provide much of an objective verification that I'm holding a rabbit behind my back. So the default position will remain that at best it's an unknown. That's not how logic works. To use the analogy of a law court again, the whole thing is geared towards an accusation that somebody is guilty, and the prosecution have to provide evidence to convince the judge or jury that they are guilty. They don't go into a court in a sort of neutral position and the defense provide a ton of evidence as to why they're not guilty. If the prosecution didn't provide evidence as to why they were guilty in the first place, the defense wouldn't need to provide any evidence of why they were innocent, because there would be nothing to answer. So the default position, the neutral position, it is a neither one nor the other at best. And the journey from that neutral default position is necessarily initially towards or in support of the claim that is being made. So if any claim is made, the onus is on the person making the claim to prove it, and then it's up to the non-believers or the opposing view to try and counter those claims. Now, some people try and argue that how is an atheistic worldview not subject to that rule itself? Because after all, the atheistic worldview is making the claim that there is no God. You can't make a positive claim that a thing doesn't exist without there being a claim that it does. You can't be anti-something if the something doesn't exist to begin with. We've seen some good examples of how one side of a debate can be overtly dealing with the subjective, whilst the other is dealing with the objective. And just in these opening statements, you can feel where the debate is heading. You can feel that what is going to happen will be Cliffe making a number of claims, if you like, or trying to offer proof or justification for his worldview that are purely subjective based, which are impossible for anybody to verify unless they already share that worldview. And then I suppose Matt will be offering more objective based counterpoints, if you like, citing things from science, I would imagine, that suggest that the religious worldview does not stand up to scrutiny, really. Anyway, that was a little bit of a look into how subjective and objective can show themselves in a debate, and how maybe certain worldviews or certain positions can rely or promote one more heavily than the other. And I think that's just the nature of debates in these sorts of topics. But as always, I hope that you found some value in that video and that it was of some interest to you. I would love to hear your comments and your thoughts or complaints. Point out anything that you think I missed out. I do find it very interesting reading the comments that I get, and I'm incredibly grateful for all of them. And any likes and subscribes also are very appreciated. So thanks for your time as always, and I'll see you again soon.